An jedem Tag nur zu denken an Deutschland, an Volk und an Reich, an unsere deutsche Nation und der deutsche Volk Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
Adolf Hitler, the Führer, dictator of Nazi Germany, along with Mao and Stalin, one of the most evil killer leaders of the 20th century. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I. The treaty stripped defeated Germany of territory, of weapons, and what was left of its economy. Hitler was provoked to write his book, Mein Kampf, in English, My Struggle, where he laid out his plan for a new world order. His Nazi party would restore Germany and take over Europe.
You know, I was a young guy also in those days, but I think their aim was how to, by political measures, you know, get an improvement of the whole situation, means primarily economically, politically. And no member of any other party was idolized like Hitler in his party. He was a great leader, you know? And nothing, no word against him, no critique against him. What he said, this was right. Know that.
In 1933, he anointed himself Führer, leader, and dictator. Hitler demanded loyalty from every German, not loyalty to their country, but to him, personally, by name.
First thing that was implemented by Hitler after he had taken to power was a ministry of propaganda. And under this ministry, all of the information industry had been centralized within half a year. That is, there was only one radio channel that was completely controlled by the Nazis, and all of the print industry, all newspapers, all magazines were under control of a censor that sat in the Ministry of Propaganda. It was strictly forbidden by law to listen to foreign radio stations, to radio stations outside Germany. So the first thing they tried was to limit the Germans' view on the outside world and make them think in the direction the Nazi Party had decided the people should think to. Hitler managed to reduce unemployment within 2 years to less than 1 million. So he was cheered upon like as if he had magical powers. And most of the people thought, well, this Jewish thing is really disgusting. But basically, he seems to be the right man at the right place.
In fiery speeches, day and night, to thousands, he preached two great evils, Judaism and communism. Over 6 years, Hitler built an overwhelmingly powerful and tactically brilliant military force, ground, sea, and air. He took over Austria and Czechoslovakia, then in 1939 invaded Poland. Within 3 months, he crushed 6 countries, controlled most of Western Europe, and was knocking on France's door. In the spring of 1940, the Germans surrounded nearly 340,000, mostly British and French, troops. Their only escape was from the shore of the port of Dunkirk in northwestern France. The water was extremely shallow, so British destroyers could not approach the beaches without running aground. Well, Prime Minister Winston Churchill mobilized every possible private boat, over 700 of them, to cross the English Channel from Ramsgate in eastern Britain to the rescue. Pleasure boats, yachts, fishing boats, any boat with a shallow draft to navigate the shallow water and ferry troops out to the waiting ships, or sail them back to England. Over 10 days that spring, they became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk and saved more than 338,000 British and French troops to fight another day. And that day came very soon when the Germans began what became known as the Blitz. Nearly 10 months of bombing Britain, day and night, the Battle of Britain. Churchill, in one of his powerful radio talks, rallied his country.
Large numbers of civilians and women and children, that he will terrorize and and consuming flame until the last vestiges of Nazi tyranny have been burnt out of Europe.
One hero of the Blitz was an airplane, the Spitfire. During the Blitz, British pilots shot down nearly 2,000 German aircraft and lost more than 1,000 of their own. Britain survived the Blitz. The Battle of Britain was one of the turning points of World War II. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to all of you, and please welcome now the Executive Director of the Collings Foundation. His name is Rob Collings, the historian for the foundation, Joe Scheel, and the son of one of the pilots who flew this very airplane in England, and his name is John Doherty. Welcome our guest, please. Gentlemen, morning.
Morning.
Rob, start us out. In fact, all three of you are pilots. And as hooked as we all are on aviation, or none of us would be here today, I wondered, can you recall what it was that got you hooked on flying if you were a kid? The first flight, something. What got you into aviation?
My great uncle was a Corsair pilot in World War II. So that had an effect on me at an early age, and I would go to events like Oshkosh, and back when Harlingen, Texas was going on down there, to the CAF air show with my father, and just got hooked on it.
Okay.
It's a real addiction.
Joe, what about you?
I grew up in rural New Jersey, and I lived in a spot removed from other homes. And when I was around 4 or 5, they were spraying for the spruce budworm with big old twin and multi-engine airliners and cargo planes. And I remember a big Lockheed twin, like a PV-2 Harpoon, flying over the head, spraying bug spray. And I think that probably did something to my head, but I certainly never forgot the feeling of strength and power from an airplane flying over, but also its ability that it went in a transcended time. It went somewhere else. In the time that I walked from the yard into the house, it was in another city. And for some reason, that was a very important thing for me. I realized that technology and the manifestation of it, airplanes, were something that that's how people move around this world. And it's a bigger place because of it.
So there is some rural New Jersey besides the big fuel tanks?
It's the Garden State.
I had to take that shot as that wasn't
the
fair.
Garden State.
That's right. Joe flies for Alaska Air, flies all the warbirds. So does Rob. John, what got you hooked on aviation?
Well, I guess growing up with my father's stories about this airplane and flying in World War II. I grew up in the Bahamas, and we'd travel around. We had to go by airplane. Quite often I got to fly with my father, and yeah, I was just hooked on it. It gave me 40 years of aviation career out of that.
Wow. Rob, the foundation. What is the foundation? What do you do? Why do you do it?
Well, the Collins Foundation was started back in 1979 to preserve living history events. It was really around transportation at the time, antique automobiles, hill climbs, ice cutting, and different recreations like that. And it was in the mid-'80s when it transitioned into aviation. And in 1989, we started the Wings of Freedom Tour, initially with the B-24 Liberator, and then adding the B-17 Flying Fortress, B-25 Mitchell, and P-51 Mustang. And they travel all over the country as a traveling museum where the folks can come out and see the aircraft, which is a lot easier to do in your hometown than to, say, travel to Dayton, Ohio. So to date, we've done over 3,100 tour stops nationwide in 28 years and shared these aircraft with a lot of the veterans who flew them, the children and grandchildren of those veterans, and on also the younger generations to educate them what it was like during World War II.
So the mission is primarily what in terms of education? What do you want to happen as a result of all this effort?
There's so many different educational facets that you could take away from these aircraft, whether it's engineering. To me, it's the history, it's the human side. It's learning lessons that we continually forget. And this airplane's one of them that really tells a major lesson for U.S. policy today. And we make the same mistakes over and over again.
Joe, you're a historian on this, all of this. What's the mission of all these efforts to inform, especially young people, about this history?
I think the biggest facet that applies to everyone is that we all have a decision process that we make throughout the day. We have a decision process that we make at work. We have a decision process that we make at home. We can see in wartime history, especially, the end result of a series of decisions. Not only did the British have to make decisions with clarity to fight on any given day, but they also had to invest time. Even during, these factories were on the front lines. Even though there was a fight right outside the front door, literally, they still went in at night or during the day when the battles weren't going on when the battles were happening at night. And they invested time to create better weapons, to create better engines, better fuels. And it gives us, it's a very close parallel today in that we have decisions to make about our job, we have decisions to make about our family, but we must also take 30% of that time perhaps and invest it in thinking for the future, in thinking about the next battles that we should be fighting. And that's what's transcendent about this airplane. And what the foundation wants to do is to show this is not just a battle, but it's investment, it's research and development, it's flight testing, it's training, it's everything that is so big for our lives today.
And in this case, lessons learned from this one airplane. And actually, this airplane,
yes,
BR-601, why is that so significant? BR-601.
That is her serial number. She is the 6th Mark 9 made. And for most of us, we think if there would be a factory production line and this would be the 6th one off after extensive testing and prototypes. That's not true here. This is one of in effect, the pre-production prototypes. Rolls-Royce and Supermarine, because of the urgency of the situation, had decided to modify 100 airframes with this Merlin 61 engine. And the reason for that was the RAF had given up trying to fight over the Channel and over France. The FW-190 was better, and it had driven the RAF away from
That was a German airplane.
Yes, it had driven them off the continent. And the British, the RAF precluded any, they said no more fighter operations over France in November of 1941. And it maintained that stasis throughout the winter until the Germans sailed the English Channel with their 2 battleships and the famous Channel Dash. The RAF and then German propaganda skewered Fighter Command, saying, "Where are the fighters?" And Fighter Command was forced in February to start flying again over France. And in the 5 months that they tried, they lost 335 fighters, nearly a squadron per week. Eventually, in June of 1942, they stopped again. They said, "We cannot do it. We're losing too many men." And so it wasn't until August that this airplane and 12 of her sisters were ready, or 16 of her sisters were ready.
Of 42?
Of 42, to go back to France, to fly over Dunkirk and those areas, and to assert the British defensive strategy, which is...
Yeah. Go ahead.
When you think about their fact they had their back against the wall so much, the pilots had 2 training flights on this aircraft before the first combat mission.
So they were actually test pilots.
They were test pilots.
In combat.
Yeah, well, actually, the test pilot was a Polish female pilot who delivered the aircraft.
You think back, we talk about women aviation now, but here this is 1942, and that plane was delivered from the factory to the squadron by a female.
She took it from the factory to a
Come
maintenance
on, where's
unit.
the applause from the women out here?
It truly was a global effort, because you had a Polish female pilot who found her way to England. This aircraft was flown by Norwegians, Australians, New Zealanders, a Polish squadron, Belgians. It wasn't just the British pilots flying it, but they were taking it up, and the airplane was the first Mark 9 to ever fly a combat mission. But of more historical relevance, on August 17, 1942, it flew the first escort mission for the 8th Bomber Command, what we would commonly call the 8th Air Force. It was not a big effort. It was 12 aircraft, 12 B-17s that flew to Rouen in France, and it was led by Major Paul Tibbets, who we know from the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Right.
This is probably more historically relevant for him. Dropping of the atomic bomb ended the war, but that was a 2-time occurrence. Strategic air power, what we did then, the 8th Air Force did, along with Eaker on this mission and all these other personalities, was change our foreign policy doctrine. We went from an isolationist nation to one that had air power to exert our will on other countries, which we do to this day.
Go back to what the circumstances were when they were at the factories, when they were building airplanes. And what was going on? The Blitz, I mean, we said the Blitz was over, but was the Blitz ever over?
It was never over. So the Battle of Britain had ended, what we think of commonly. It was referred to as the Baedeker Blitz, was the second run of this. The Germans continued to bomb England incessantly, but they were going after a couple of strategic targets. One of them was the city of Portsmouth, which is where this airplane was built. So it was bombed multiple times, going after this factory while this aircraft was in production. So you have to think of it from the production standpoint of, we go out and we look at Mustangs, we look at how beautiful they are and how the quality is wonderful. Well, that's great when you had a chance to sleep that night, when your factory's not being bombed. When you're living in a country which, yes, we had rationing, but we don't import 50% of our food from abroad, which is what England had to do. So the workers in that factory, a lot of the protein source was whale blubber. We cannot think about that. We think about, we had fuel rationing in this country. In 1942 in England, fuel rationing ended. That didn't mean they had fuel to go around. That meant there was no fuel, period. You're walking to work. So this is truly an aircraft that was built when their back was against the wall. It's a modified aircraft. It is totally unique from any other Mark 9 aside of the other 100, which of them none others survived.
John, your father flew this airplane
That's right, on that mission.
on that first mission with Tibbets and the B-17s.
That's correct, yes.
Tell us about your memories, the things you learned from your dad about his experience flying this airplane in the squadron.
Well, he was probably pretty typical of the average RAF fighter pilot at the time. He was very young. He joined at 19. By the time he flew this, he was an experienced fighter pilot. He just turned 21, just been commissioned as a pilot officer, which is the same as a second lieutenant in the US Air Force. He's a typical example of an ordinary man being asked to do extraordinary things. And there were hundreds like him, and he was lucky enough to survive. But he'd spent the first year or so flying with 64 Squadron and A flight. And he'd been...
Now, that was a squadron, right?
That's right, 64
Squadron.
That's correct.
Right.
So A flight was 6 aircraft roughly in each flight. And he told me that he had spent the first part of his flying career in the Air Force turning very tightly with a little bit of top rudder to avoid being shot down by the German aircraft in his rearview mirror, which you can see up on top of the cockpit there. When they started flying the Spitfire 9, which he referred to as a wizard kite, and his all-time favorite mark of Spitfire, he said for the first time he was in a situation where he was doing some of the chasing.
Wow. When you just mentioned he started flying at 19 and he was 21, I wonder how many of us can think about on a regular basis who, for the most part, actually fought World War II. And it was 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds. One person who comes to mind, Bud Anderson, who will be here, is currently America's living highest-ranking ace. Bud, in 1944, flew 116 missions. In 1942, in 1 year, had 16 and a quarter air victories, and he was 22 years old. So that's something I think a lot of us tend not to think about. What comes to your mind about that? You two guys fly all these airplanes.
Well, what BR-601 has taught us is there were about 40 pilots that flew this airplane. And the hard thing about thinking about that time is we can look at a person like Bud who had a tremendous string of I mean, he was a fantastic fighter pilot. There's absolutely no, but that's what we have to remember. This airplane was built in June of 1942. It was one of the first, and so they built 16 of these in June. Those 16 airplanes were reduced to 4 by January 1st, 1943. The 100 airplanes that they built that were modified, fully 70 of them did not survive World War II. Fully 40 of them didn't survive 1942, which was just a matter of months. So the one thing I would like to stress just is that we can't conceive of being a 17-kill ace. That's big. But you have to remember that there were 99 other men that served in a grouping of 100. Probably 5 maybe shot down another airplane. 4 or 5 didn't shoot down anybody but survived the war, and then the other 70 or so didn't make it.
In the story also it tells in the aircraft's 121 missions that it flew in World War II, 40 of them were escorting 8th Bomber Command aircraft. So not only that first mission, it escorted Memphis Belle 4 times, including the legendary 25th mission. It was flying escort on the first B-24 mission, the first B-26 mission before they were 9th Air Force, the first P-38 mission, and so on. It was there for so many of these events. And it was a multinational effort. As I mentioned, Norwegians, Belgian, New Zealand, Australian pilots were all there saving American lives. So not only were there 19, 20-year-olds in this airplane, but it's how many hundreds of our airmen, made it home as a result of it. And that's a bit telling of our unpreparedness. We didn't have an escort fighter at that time. We sent over P-38s that were not prepared, and they weren't able to do that, and we didn't have enough aircraft. And the missions were short. They weren't going deep into Europe. They were going into France, Holland. We weren't going deep into Germany. But even when we did, they were still flying over occupied territory. In fact, when this airplane was finally retired, we still hadn't invaded Europe. It had flown for 2 years. So every mission they had was a dangerous mission. And even when we had P-47s with drop tanks that could go a longer distance into Europe, they were vulnerable. So it's unusual to see this airplane flying escort for fighters. But to get across the coast, to get them further into Europe, they had to do that. Because the Germans knew, hey, just jump those P-47s with drop tanks. They're going to pop their tanks off to engage, to defend themselves. And then they're not going all the way deeper into Germany to defend the bombers.
Yeah. How significant was this airplane engine to the development of the P-51 Mustang?
This is the engine which developed into the Packard Merlin-7 that you see in all the Mustangs out here. So it started off as a Merlin 61, and it was a prototype motor. It was something that Rolls-Royce came up with on their own because they realized the RAF needed something. They needed to go higher. The Mark V, you'll hear pilots today that talk about it. Beautiful flying airplane, and that's wonderful. But it wasn't a good weapon. This weaponized the Spitfire to fly higher. This is where the fight was. It was able to take on Focke-Wulfs, which the Mark V really was not up to the task. And when John talked about his father saying this was the best airplane, if you read all of the pilot reports, that's what they were saying. This is the plane they wanted. And a few of them were put back into Mark Vs because they didn't have enough of the engines to go around. The production of Mark Vs continued on for years afterwards, just on the supply of the motors. And you would have thought these guys were beaten once they were sent off to a squadron of Mark Vs. It's like, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? I'm going off and flying this old heap.
Speaking of pilots like John's dad, Tony Gaze, who was he?
Well, Tony Gaze is a gentleman who's flown this aircraft both at 64 Squadron and later 453, which was an Australian squadron. But he's an Aussie who was up at Cambridge and University at the time when the war broke out, and he decided he was going to join the RAF. And his brother said, "Wait for me, I'm going to come with you." And they both joined the RAF and became fighter pilots. And his brother didn't survive the war, but Tony went on to do quite a lot. He had 12.5 victories. He was the first Australian to shoot down a jet, an ME-262, shot down an Arado 234 jet, V-1 rocket, and also was Australia's first jet pilot by the end of the war. He flew this aircraft, and on October 11th, he had a Focke-Wulf, which he had shot down. And he describes it in the book as the most terrified he'd ever been because he got so close. And in fact, on his logbook, it says, bloody near rammed it. And he got into the contrail and the whole canopy iced up. But it was in a situation where most of the aircraft had a mechanical return to base. So there were only 4 Spitfires mixing it up with the squadron of Focke-Wulfs over France. And now you're sitting there and you can't see anything. And the Focke-Wulf was a very formidable adversary to any aircraft. And you're now at 35,000 feet. You can't see anything. He was just diving down. Now, for this gentleman to say that's the most scared he'd ever been, he later was shot down over near Paris, and he walked all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains, across the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, with his little resistance-made identity card that said he was an organist, and he was a mute. So if anyone tried to talk to him, well, I can't speak French, I'm a mute. I would have thought that would have been a lot more scary. After the war, Tony came home, and this is kind of the cost of war. His brother didn't. His father didn't meet him at the port. And when he finally saw his dad, he said the wrong brother came home. This is a guy, 12.5 victory ace, who was flying literally from the Battle of Britain to the end of the war, in combat the whole time, 3 DFCs, and it didn't live up.
And by the way, with us, sitting here with us, is Georgina Moore, who is Tony Gaze's niece. Georgina, it's nice to have you with us. How much of any of this history, thank you. How much of any of this history do you have in your ability to chat about Tony's experiences that we just heard something about?
Tony was the most extraordinary man. He grew up with my father, and he, excuse me.
That's right.
He was very quiet. He was a very tall man. He was 6'4", so to actually fit in was a bit of an effort. He was just incredible in the way that he just took everything in his stride. And the fact that his brother, who didn't make it back, and that terrible thing with his father, who said that he was the wrong one, was devastating, I think, to everyone, really. He loved talking about his time during the Second World War and all the different aircraft. He was just an exceptional, very easygoing man who could do amazing things.
But he would talk about some of these experiences because
Yes,
we
he
understand
did.
there are
Yeah.
loads of veterans who have experiences they don't really feel comfortable talking about, but he did.
Yes, he did. He was first married in England, and when his English wife died, he came out to Australia and he married Diana Davison, who was her husband passed away in a car accident. He was a racing driver, and so was Tony. And you'd just go out for dinner, and he would chat about it. The aircraft, he just loved the Spitfire. The Spitfire was his tool, and he obviously knew how to fly it extremely well.
What's this experience like for you and John to be here at Oshkosh with this particular airplane?
It's like reliving Tony's life. I mean, it's the fact that it's here and I'm looking at it, and to think that he actually flew that at the age of 20 and did what he did it's bringing back his life. It's the history of the war, and of course and Tony.
She was a bit understating there when she said he was a race car driver after the war. He was Australia's first Formula One driver before Jack Brabham, so he's quite a national hero.
Right. John, what is this experience like for you to be here with this plane? Your dad flew.
Yeah, it's very, very emotional. I'm just so delighted to see such a beautiful aircraft, even if he hadn't flown it, in such good shape and telling this story. It really is special.
The human side is fascinating because we knew this aircraft was a very historic airplane when we acquired it. We knew it was the 6 Mark IX. We knew it had flown a lot of missions. But one thing we didn't know until John walked into the hangar in Biggin Hill was that it flew the first 8th Air Force mission. But he came in and he goes, yeah, my dad flew that airplane, SHF BR-601, opened up his logbook, and there it was. And the next entry was, flew with Paul Tibbets up to Polebrook where they had a party. And the RAF records are absolutely phenomenal. And the logbooks that we've gotten from John and from the Gaze family and from all over the world tell a story about it. But a lot of it was the story of the life that they lived and not just the missions. And it was incredible to see this engagement. I mean, you're flying with Paul Tibbets in a B-17. Tony was the co-pilot. And 17 of these guys went up and they had a party. And it said, well, the dinner was at 18:30. And I was rather stung by then. So they were drinking heavily. And there was a hangar dance going on, but it seemed like they couldn't be bothered with that because we see English women all the time. What we really want was the food. So they did a rhubarb, which is a fighter sweep of the kitchen, and destroyed a plate of sandwiches. And that tells you these were starving guys.
Yeah.
They were really interested in going and finding what the Army Air Corps had to eat. And they had several of these encounters where they would meet up with the squadrons that they were escorting. Another one was a P-38 group, and it seemed like they all came back very hungover, wearing uniforms that were not quite regulation. Apparently one of them was a Army Air Corps major's uniform that they traded out, and it was hanging down to his knees. So they were having fun, but it was guys who were living close to death all the time. And about a third of the pilots who flew this aircraft didn't survive the war.
Right. Georgina, you listening to all of that, does that bring any other thoughts to mind? The partying?
Partying, of course, yes. He would have been a rager. He was very quiet, actually. He wasn't, I'm sure he did, you know, in his own way, do his thing. I can remember meeting him probably not so long ago, probably about 10 years ago, and he was giving a talk on his experiences, and he was just so blasé, you know. He'd sit there and he'd say, yes, I was, you know, I shot down 12, you know, Messerschmitts, and that I'd done this, and then he'd go into the total rundown of the engine and how it all worked, and yeah. So he was a very mechanical, he did engineering at Cambridge, he just loved it. So anything with an engine, whether it be a car or a plane, he was full of knowledge.
You know, Joe, the history, now getting to the restoration of this, and Rob mentioned it just briefly about finding the airplane. What was the process? What was the journey of this airplane before you found it?
The aircraft was very unusual in that it was an early aircraft that had survived to 1944 before it was damaged fairly heavily and sent back to Supermarine for rebuild. They reconditioned the airplane and provided it to the nation of South Africa near the end of the war. They put it on a ship and sent it to South Africa, where it was flown for a few years prior to the Korean War, in which South Africa actually fought alongside the United States in the Korean conflict. The airplane, and we've just talked to there's many representatives of the nation of South Africa here at AirVenture, and what's been great is they've brought they're thrilled to see this airplane as well. The scrapyard owner that was tasked with destroying South Africa's Spitfires in 1950 or so he had a helicopter on a pylon, and the South African Museum wanted the first South African helicopter off of this pole. And so they went to him and asked for the thing, and he said, well, I'll give you the helicopter, but I want a Spitfire. So the South African Air Force, which was destroying the Spitfires in the yard in Snake Valley, sent this very airplane just by chance to go up on the pole. And it sat there, and many of the people in the audience that were from South Africa drove past it and dreamed about it as a child, when they were children, anyway. The airplane was down from the pole, I believe, around 1982, and it was a project from that point on. But because she was very unusual, not a straight Mark 9, but a modification of a 5, and lots of strangeness to the brand new restoration industry, she was kind of left as alone, and in fact traded for around 40,000 pounds in the early 80s because nobody really wanted to tackle the project. The airplane was kind of misunderstood. Nobody really knew what she was or why. It was only really as we were vetting airplanes, looking for we were looking for an airplane of great significance. Rob and I both felt, as we were talking about it, that this being number 6 had to have a tremendous history. And we kind of we just bet on this horse in a way. And
now, when was this?
Oh, this was around 2008. Was that it?
No, the aircraft was acquired about 4 years ago, and
Okay.
it was some donors of ours that made it possible.
Yeah, and so at that point, you know, when the restoration began.
So what shape was it in when you acquired it?
Well, so it came back from South Africa, and it was a complete airplane at the time. That auction that Joe referenced in about 1984, my father was at, and he passed on it. Oh man, that's a big project. Everyone was talking it down. Well, it would have been a good buy at the time. It bounced around the world after that.
Greater monetary value now?
A little bit. So it actually was in the U.S. It was down at the Lone Star Flight Museum at some point. Then it was in New Zealand, and that's when we acquired the aircraft. And the fuselage was complete. The wings that were with the airplane when it came back from South Africa were not its wings. So you can see these have the 303 guns, the little red covers, which is basically a Mark V wing. It's what they call a C wing. All the other Mark 9s had the E-wing, which was the standardized with the cannons and the 50 calibers, and they did away with the 303s. So the wings weren't with the airplane, but Peter Monk, who just scours the world to buy up Spitfire stuff, had parts that he brought back from South Africa, and they were these type of wings. We don't know if they were the ones for BR-601 because there were 3 aircraft down there that would have had that type of wing. But we tried to gather up as much of the original parts to that aircraft as possible. Fuselage was all complete, and then the wings. But in the course of a rebuild for a flying Spitfire, spars are replaced. You have to go pretty deep into the restoration. But wherever we can, we want to use the original parts to the airplane, and if not, original parts to the time period for the Spitfire. So if you go into look in the cockpit, all the gauges are 1942. The instrument panel surround is the original phenolic. The instrument panel has the Air Ministry stamp. It's original. The rudder trim indicator has its original paint. So we would use parts out of the box. Having something that was new build was the last resort. We'd always try to use something that was original to the aircraft or original Spitfire period production versus having something that's new build. And that's a little different from the way the warbird industry has been for restorations.
In what way?
Well, they're rough. You look at parts of this aircraft, you look at that carburetor intake, it's kind of rough. But that's an original. That was hammered out by hand at the factory at that time. And Gary Norville's here, and if he built something like that of that quality in his shop for one of our aircraft, we'd have a word. But that's the way it was. So it's not the fit and finish that you think of a U.S.-built airplane.
Do you all both fly this plane?
I fly the aircraft.
You fly this. Yes. Yours. Does anyone else fly it?
Yes, there have been a couple other pilots who've flown it.
But not often.
2 in England and then 1 here in the U.S., Elliot Cross.
John, what?
he's waiting in line.
Exactly. Joe, the restoration, how challenging is it to?
Well, for somebody like Peter Monk, the specialization to do this Spitfire is not really available in the United States yet. There's a bond that in some cases the British, but in other cases the Commonwealth, people have. When they see a Spitfire, it's a very emotional event.
It's a religious experience.
Yes, and it's even and for us, I mean, for Rob and I to be so deeply involved in researching this for the last 6 months, the struggle that they actually had, from the Battle of Britain to the invasion, has become very real to us. To see that these regular people were under bomb, under threat of attack, at war, seeing their hard work, the pieces of their hard work fall from the sky that the Germans had destroyed, and going home thinking, I wonder how we could do that, or to build the better mousetrap. To be involved in that struggle, we get it, but in the UK they get that on an they grew up with this. So their attention to detail on the restoration when we get it is simply marvelous. We look at the beautiful wheels, everything on the airplane being original, the canopy not being a modern piece of plexiglass, but being an actual NOS piece of World War II Mark 9 canopy put on this airplane. This is just unbelievable amounts of original, correct parts that were saved. Peter Monk probably saved the pieces saying, I'm going to put this on the best Spitfire. I'm going to put this on the most important Spitfire. Well, to wake up in the morning for Rob and I, or for the foundation specifically, I mean, there's 100 of us working hard every day for the foundation all over the country, to wake up and realize that we have the Spitfire that brings tears to people's eyes is a sobering responsibility, and it's a tremendous, tremendous gift.
And it brought tears to Peter Monk's eyes after he sold it to us, and they started to realize the history.
What he had done.
And as soon as this man walked in the door and said, "Yeah, my dad flew it on the first 8th Air Force mission,"
God.
it really brought tears to his eyes. He was wanting to buy it back then.
John, as they start talking about their realization of some of the experiences that Brits went through that we can't appreciate when we were born and raised here, what stories do you recall from your family and or friends, a generation before you, about what that whole period was like when Britain was under attack?
Well, as I understand it, it was unrelenting. Because if you think about it, they had the Battle of Britain and the First London Blitz. But they had ongoing raids all through the war. Everybody was involved. The civilians were in the front line. So it was very emotional. 2 days after my dad flew with the Tibbets raid, he flew one of the sister ships over Dieppe. I had a Canadian uncle, Frank Bevan, down on the beach at Dieppe, driving Churchill tank, which didn't get very far, and he spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. My grandfather was in the Royal Navy, and he was at Dunkirk. So everybody was involved. It really was emotional.
Yeah.
What I would say also, there's a few other people who flew this aeroplane are probably worth a bit of a
Put
mention.
the mic a little closer.
Sorry about that.
That's good.
Yeah. When that airplane was crashed, and a very important guy who was flying it, he was a squadron commanding officer, a guy called Colin Gray. And any New Zealanders out here will know who he is, because not only did he shoot down 27 and a half airplanes himself during the war, he went on to run the New Zealand Air Force after the war. And another guy, subsequently Lieutenant General Michel Donnet, he flew it. And he was quite an interesting character. He'd escaped from Belgium in a light airplane. He'd repaired in a barn without the Germans noticing. Flew over to the UK. And he was my dad's flight commander in 64 Squadron. And he went on to reorganize the Belgian Air Force after the war and commanded, I think it was the 2nd Tactical Air Force in NATO. So a lot of history with this airplane.
And Colin Gray was the highest scoring New Zealand ace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
He ground looped this airplane. That was the damage. So I guess if you're the highest scoring ace from your country, they'll let that slide.
and beside the Polish woman who first flew the airplane to the squadron, when she went to the Polish squadron, the first pilot to fly it on the first training gunnery mission was a Polish pilot named Jan Zurakowski, and he flew everything. He flew virtually everything in the RAF inventory, but eventually became a famous test pilot in Canada, and was the final pilot of the beautiful CF-105 Arrow that the Canadians flew, and everybody knows that name in the RAF.
Didn't he break the speed of sound as well?
Georgina, as we were talking about the experience of Brits, during the war, and what everybody experienced, what stories come to your mind?
Well, being Australian, of course, it's a bit different. But my father was in Bougainville, and my uncle was also in Bougainville. So it was more ground-based for our family. The Gaze family, well, Tony was obviously in the air, but his brother Scott was killed only 2 weeks after he got there. So he was in training. I think I'm a pilot too, believe it or not. So and my daughter is here too, and she also flies. So it opened that many doors for us to experience. Well, I mean, the history tells it all. I mean, we have a world because of what they did, and it's just a fantastic experience to be able to get up in the air. And I used to fly passengers around Australia as an air tour. So yeah, it's a brilliant history to be able to. And look, I think for Tony, it's so good to be able to honour what he did, because of my idea of war was very little, I must admit. But to do what he did and survive it is extraordinary. In fact, that when he was shot down, he said that he could see he was blowing black smoke out the back. So he realised he had to do something about it. So he landed in the trees, and the German pilot who had, I think it was Kurt Voigt, I think, Tony waved from the aircraft saying, "I'm okay." And he just winged off. He didn't bother about trying to shoot him. So, and then he got into the resistance and was able to work his way back to England. It took just over 8 weeks to get home.
John, last thoughts about being here at Oshkosh with this airplane?
It's just amazing. I'm just so pleased this has happened. I think this is such a significant aircraft. To see it preserved for the future is just wonderful.
Good. Joe?
I would just want everyone that's watching here and stuff that come talk to us, come look at the airplane, but look at this as the one of the only times. I mean, for us being seasoned warbird people, the markings that are on this airplane are not the markings that we wanted. This is what it had. This is an original combat airplane, and it's something that is so rare today. There might be 5 or 6, combat veteran Mustangs. There might be 20 Spitfires, but for this to have the record it does, it's truly a transcendent airplane and just an amazing, amazing history. So come up and just touch it.
And by the way, on that, when we finish in just a couple of minutes, you all are welcome to come join the 3 gentlemen around the airplane and learn more about it from them if you care to do that. Last thoughts?
The Foundation is lucky to have a lot of really important aircraft, but this is the first one where we have engaged with a lot of the family members who flew in it. Our B-24 was an RAF Lend-Lease airplane and combat aircraft, and we got a logbook at some point in time of someone who flew it in combat.
By the way, how many B-24s are still flying?
Well, that's a point of discussion. I would say there's one B-24 left flying, and there's an LB-30, but 1 or 2, very few out of the 18,500 that were built. Right. But it's really amazing. We're getting contacted by people in South Africa, Australia, all over the place that had family members that were part of this, and some of them didn't come home.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.